UFO 50 is a new indie game that contains 50 brand new, retro-style video games by a team of 6 all-star indie developers, including Derek Yu of Spelunky fame and Ojiro Fumoto, creator of Downwell. The narrative is that these 50 games were developed in the 1980s by a fictional game development studio, UFO Soft, who also designed and manufactured the bespoke computer hardware that the games run on. The timeline of the game releases in UFO 50 spans from 1982 to 1989, culminating in the unfortunate collapse of UFO Soft. There are a bunch of real-life inspirations that went into the story of UFO Soft and their collection of 50 classic games, but a major one is undoubtedly Nintendo. The NES is such a cultural touchstone that it is the first real-life historical gaming equipment that people bring up in comparisons to the games in UFO 50, even if slightly more accurate comparisons could be made. Like, UFO 50, across its 50 games and every menu, uses a strict color palette of 32 colors, handpicked by the developers. This is an almost exact midpoint of the color possibilities between the MSX's 15 colors and the Sega Master System's 64 colors. The NES palette has 55 colors. But really, it's the games themselves in UFO 50 that make people think of the NES, because unlike most major game consoles, Nintendo not just produced the hardware, but also developed in-house a large portion of the best games for their own hardware. So here is my thought experiment for today. What would the game list be if Nintendo put out their own UFO 50 in, let's say, 1994, as that was the year the final NES game developed by Nintendo released? There is a whole suite of oddities that need to be considered when putting together an NES equivalent UFO 50. Let's go over them before I reveal the list. There are over 50 games to choose from, but several edge cases are formed. For example, what do we do with the Famicom Disk System games? The Famicom Disk System is an add-on for the Famicom that came out in 1986, 3 years after the release of the Famicom in 1983. Many classic NES games are ports of Famicom Disk System games, including Nintendo-developed ones. The Disk System never left Japan, and never got an NES version, so all games developed for it had to be backported to NES if developers wanted to release those games internationally. But this wasn't so bad, as late into the Famicom's life, developers mostly abandoned the disk system and focused on releasing games on cartridges again instead, because Famicom and NES game cartridges could include extra hardware inside them that unlocked new capabilities. Much of the latter half of the NES library's games use things like memory mapper chips to expand what types of games are possible on the NES. The gap in computing power from games like Super Mario Bros. 1 to Kirby's Adventure, Punch-Out!, and Super Mario Bros. 3 is tangible and exists thanks to extra hardware in the cartridges themselves. The discs of the Famicom Disk System are not upgradable in similar ways. Anyway, because the hardware is similar enough that games were able to be backported to NES, I find no problem in including Disk System games in our Nintendo's UFO 50 list. To reach 50 games, I had to include at least a few games by developers who are or were considered second-party developers for Nintendo, like HAL Laboratory, who made Kirby's Adventure, and Pax Softnica, who developed the first Mother game and some of the latter black box Nintendo sports titles. I narrowed their games down to ones only published directly by Nintendo to strengthen the link. Another concern is games developed by Nintendo that were remakes or ports of other games by other developers for other systems, like Kung Fu and Ginga no Sannin. These games I have left out in the spirit of UFO 50, including games made by the people who worked at the development studio that also produced the hardware. What about light gun games? I've decided to include light gun games to flesh out the list of Nintendo's UFO 50, even if it might go against the very strict control scheme of UFO 50's games. I've also included the Rob games. These games could be excluded in favor of others by being lax on any of the previous restrictions. I have also not included any game developed by Rare, even though several were published by Nintendo for the NES. In the same vein, I have not included Dragon Quest I nor Final Fantasy I, because despite both being published by Nintendo in America, those games don't fit the bill of being developed by Nintendo. Finally, as you might expect, I did indeed need to pull from some games never released outside of Japan. So that's how I narrowed down the list from roughly 60 possibilities down to 50, using my invented restrictions. Here's the game lineup. first thing that strikes me when seeing the full list is wow, UFO 50 clears this list. The overall quality across every game is just so much higher. That's the real fantasy of UFO 50. The major factor in that quality difference is that Nintendo was not the only company developing games for their hardware, and they themselves had been developing fancier games on newer hardware as early as 1987. For that reason, my Nintendo UFO 50 list leans heavily on the early years, which is quite the opposite of UFO 50. Third parties picked up the slack in the latter half of the NES's life. Companies like Capcom and Konami, for example, had robust NES development pipelines by 1987, and put out many fantastic NES games between 1987 and 1993. UFO 50's UFO Soft ramped up development on their hardware themselves, increasing their output and the size of their games as the 80s went on. Maybe a more fair NES comparison to UFO 50 would include more third-party games, but at that point, that's just an NES Classic wishlist lineup, and that's been done to death since 2016. I wish I didn't have to include the light gun games, the Rob games, or especially the black box sports games, which are almost universally terrible. I wish I didn't have to include Donkey Kong Jr. Math or Urban Champion. So that's about 11 games in there that I would consider bad. That's a lot more than UFO 50. The majority of games that I left out are other games developed by Pax Softnica exclusively for Nintendo's platforms, like Shin Onigashima, Yuyuki, and the Famicom Detective Club games. Tosei developed NES Play Action Football, and JV Dialogue developed Night Move, a puzzle game by Alexei Pajitnov with music by Hip Tanaka. Wait, is JV Dialogue just Nintendo with Alexei Pajitnov? JV Dialogue only ever released Night Move, one game, in 1990. I also left out game software that acts more as software than game, like Family Basic. It is neat, though, that my list ended up containing 2 golf games, mirroring the 2 golf games in UFO 50. Thanks for diving into this thought experiment with me. What games would you include or exclude? To what lengths would you go to get Mock Rider out of here? Let me know in the comments.